Good evening, everyone. It's Tony here from Lockster Reads. Um, it is day 12 of Remembrance Reads. I haven't done a huge amount of reading today because I'm not feeling very well. I wasn't feeling very well yesterday. Felt even worse today. But I did read a couple of things. I read one short story from the Penguin First World War Stories collection, which was Giulia, Lazzari by Somerset Maugham. It's a spy story. It was part of a short story collection he published in 1927, featuring Ashenden, who is a sort of amateur spy working for the Allies in World War One. They did, I believe, turn it into a television series back in the 1980s, and it's basically about them trying to convince somebody to persuade somebody else to come to a place where they can be arrested. It's very good, actually. It's also surprisingly cynical for a spy story of the 1920s. If you, it's like you usually expect them to be quite gung ho if you're thinking about something like Sapper or John Buchan. But there's a sort of cynical air to the whole thing that reminds you of Le Carrier more than any of the other 1920s writers. I'd like to read the whole Ashenden collection now because it sounds fascinating. It's a good story. It seems odd. The spy story one seems a little odd to be in this collection because they seem to be of another sort of genre. But I enjoyed reading it. And then I read chapter 8 of Paul Fussell's The Great War and Modern Memory, which was called Soldier Boys. The sections of which are Mars and Eros, the British homoerotic tradition, the homoerotic sensuousness of Wilfred Owen, and soldiers bathing, which you could tell what this chapter's about. The Mars and Eros section is just really about the sexuality, the possibility, the sort of connection between war and sexuality and sex. That's quite a short section actually, and it talks about the Eros was the child of Mars and Venus, and actually it focuses more. The example it gives is more about a book about World War Two, which is The Thin Red Line. But he talks about the element of like how battle is exposure, and there is something potentially exciting about that in a way that people don't generally talk about. And then he talks about the what he calls the British homoerotic tradition, which is the way there is a line in British literature that talks about lads and boys, and that their turns of their phraseology, their language, influenced how these poems were written, these pieces of literature were written in during and after the war. He doesn't actually mention. I'm trying to remember the name of the book. There is a book that has that. Can't remember who it's by, and that has a sort of example of this in it. And I wish I could remember. I'll try and remember what it's called. I'll put a note in the thing. But he talks about the sort of the lines, sort of the Oscar Wildes, the A. Housemans, and others. He also talks about a group called the Uranians or Uranians. Now these guys, it's from a 2025 perspective, it's hard to talk about these guys in a way that doesn't that can treat them in any way fairly. They were believers in the ideal of Greek love that was an older man and a younger boy. They were fundamentally paedophiles, and it's hard to fit what they were trying to do into a 2025 sensibility. I don't know how much of what they did went beyond what they wrote. Um, Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Um, and he talks about how that literature might have had an influence on Owen, um, and he compares Owen to a guy called Robert Nichol, who I've never heard of, but who was a Uranian poet. He actually quotes Fussell says, despite their gross incompetence, Nichol's poems are worth noticing because they were so popular. And this is one of the points he makes, is that although these people were writing a kind of literature that from 2025 it seems particularly weird and creepy. Um, it was read by a lot of people, and the audience was probably more innocent about what they were writing about and why they were writing it. Perhaps the writers were more innocent, um, if you want to give them sort of a kind view. Um, but and he illustrates that with examples of Owen's poetry, how he focuses on bodies, particularly eyes. He talks about how the tradition of young blonde boys, um, but it's also about and there was one of the threads through the Iranian tradition was writing books about the deaths of young boys, um, and how the language of those poems is reflected in the language of war poetry, from World War One. Um, as I said, the blonde young boy, um, but also there's an element of it that is about the um, weakness of flesh in the face of industrialized warfare. That a body can be destroyed and wiped out in a second, and talking about the bodies of these boys, these lads, is a way of demonstrating that. Um, and why he compares Owen to Nichol is that he basically shows how Owen goes beyond the tradition that Nichol represents, um, and by by making his poetry more about pity and about sorrow, and about being a witness, bear about bearing witness to what's going on. Um, it's an oh, and the last bit is about soldiers bathing, and it just illustrates how many poems, stories, memoirs have an example of um, people watching men bathe. Um, their officers watching their privates bathe naked, and how that often creeps in, and it's differently used in different books, but it's an interesting piece of writing that shows up over and over again. And again, it's as much about the fact that these naked swimmers, these naked pale swimmers, will end up being sliced to pieces by shrapnel, shot, blown up, whatever. Um, and it's sort of setting the body against the machine. It's even when it's not explicitly outlined like that. It's sort of what it's trying to say. It's trying to look at a pristine young person who's about to be destroyed by war. Um, it was an interesting chapter. It's odd because um, it's sort of not what you expect in a book like this. Um, there is a long. I mean, he talks a bit in the book about the homoerotic tradition in British poetry, um, and he lists a long list of writers. It is part of poetry going back. He uses the example, the second eclogue um, of Virgil, um, as an example of a sort of rural pastoral um, poem that talks about a man's love for a younger man. Um, I have read the eclogues and I can't remember anything about the second one. Um, they are very good, surprisingly. But yeah, so it was an interesting chapter. And it's something I would never have me being a bearer of very little brain, I never would have even considered that reading probably. But then most of this book is about finding depth, a deeper understanding of things that I probably wouldn't have understood. Um, Although having said that, I don't agree with what he's writing. And again, I do think his group is very narrow. Um, but he often in a chapter pulls forward to the writing of the Second World War, and how the First World War writing influenced it, and how the Second World War writing is different. Um, there's only one chapter left of this book, and I think a conclusion, which I'll finish tomorrow. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do about tomorrow because I've got, as I said, I'm going to be out most of the day and evening. But I don't want to miss one, so I might just cough up a video. I'll try and do some reading early in the morning and try and do a video in the afternoon. I'm sorry if this one's been a bit rambling and a bit. Well, it's no more rambling than they normally are. I'm sorry if this one's been a bit flat, as you can hear from my voice and you can hear from my exciting lack of whatever the word is I'm looking for, joie de vivre, that I haven't been up to snuff today. I will, however, continue. We have 12 days, so let's ignore today, 13 days, 17 days of November left. So let's see what we can do. I'd like to pick up the pace a bit. I'm hoping I'll feel better tomorrow. I'm going to have an early night. Anyway, let me stop rambling and being depressing. And I look forward to talking to you all again. Bye bye.